Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Simon, for inviting me to speak today. I very much appreciate that. I should say at the start that what I'm about to say is certainly not necessarily TRADSOC policy, nor is TRADSOC policy necessarily anything that A Force for Good believes, but I'm certainly very happy to be here, and I believe that the things that I have to say very much fit into the overall idea of something which is central to the general belief of the audience, which is Britain, the nation. My organisation, A Force for Good, has been around for 7 years now. We formed in 2012 when we knew that there was going to be a referendum coming on the very future of the United Kingdom itself. And I should say straight away, we're a strongly unionist organisation. That is our core policy. We believe the United Kingdom is a force for good in the world. We believe that has been the case historically, and we believe that it can be in the future. And I'd just like to ask, just for my own interest here, if I could have a show of hands of people who are actually live here in Scotland. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 of us, good. Now, for those of you who are based primarily in England, you may not perhaps be as conscious as we are up here that the Union is the central political issue in Scotland at the moment. It's not even Brexit, it's the future of the Union, or more specifically, the future of Britain, the nation, because Britain itself is a union. It's been created by, over time, England and Wales coming together, England and Wales and Scotland coming together, England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland coming together, and then of course we had the split, but we're still with Northern Ireland as well. So that Britain as a nation unionism, British unionism is, we believe, the core philosophical belief of Britain, the nation. And sometimes people don't necessarily see it in that way, but British unionism, which is what we're about, is the core fundamental thing that holds Britain together. Without British unionism, we don't have Britain. We have separate countries. That's a point of view that perhaps isn't articulated at all, except in small groups like this. But my group, A Force for Good, as I say, we've been going for a while. We're a registered company. And one of the things that we do, apart from just putting out philosophy and policy on a regular basis on our various platforms, is we are a street campaigning group. We heard about street campaigning earlier today. One of the things you can do if you're street campaigning is find a topic that it animates the population, and up here in Scotland it's the Union, and we stand when the Scottish nationalists, so-called, when they pass us, we stand with our red, white and blue flags, posters and colours, and we keep the British end up. We advocate for the United Kingdom as they're passing, and it's always a fun day. We call ourselves the Thin Red Line. There's always 20 to maybe 40, sometimes more, of us. We've got our Union Jack flags, we've got our posters, we've got our banners, and we make sure that people looking on know that there is such a thing as the United Kingdom, there is such a thing as Great Britain, and we're here to stay, and we're not going to let the Scottish nationalists get away with it. Now, when I say Scottish nationalists, some people, I got the impression listening earlier, they see the word nationalist as a good thing. Here in Scotland, the only people who call themselves nationalists are the Scottish nationalists. So if I'm using the word nationalist, don't be offended by it. I'm just describing the Scottish nationalists, because that's what they call themselves. I was going to call this 10 Things to Strengthen the Union. Now, what we've been hearing earlier, we had a couple of strong, well-articulated speeches. These were very philosophically based. This particular talk of mine is going to be policy-based. Okay, it's just bringing it down to things that politically we can do, specifically to maintain and strengthen the British Union here in Scotland. I was going to call this 10 things, but as I was putting it together, I realised there's more than 10 things, and so it'd be more appropriate, especially since I'm speaking to the Tradsock Society, that I use the imperial factor of 12 rather than the French revolutionary factor of 10. So I thought 12 things that we can do to strengthen the Union. And I've split this into 4 sections. Several things, 4 things on the Constitution of the United Kingdom itself. Several matters related to a referendum, specifically, if such a second referendum on Scottish separation were to happen. Several matters related to just general political policy, and then finally the personal, about what we as individuals can actually do in this particular battle that we have here in Scotland to maintain the British Union, which, as I say, is ultimately about maintaining Britain as a coherent nation in itself. And what we can do to keep this flag flying, this beautiful flag which was originally designed by the Scottish King James VI when he became King of Great Britain, as he liked to style it, in 1603. Because King James was one of our earliest Unionists. The historians of this day continue to call him James I of England or James VI of Scotland, but in reality he wanted to be called James VI of Great Britain because he saw in his being the coming together of all the people of Scotland, England and Wales at that time. And he designed this flag in April 1604, which of course had the addition of the St. Patrick's Cross in 1801 after the Irish Union. Anyway, constitutionally, one of the first things that we can do, and I know some of the things I'm going to be talking about might be new to some people here today, especially those who are not involved or don't follow the Scottish political debate. But the first thing is regarding devolution. Now, devolution was never properly understood in the first place. It was a response by Tony Blair to try to appease the growing Scottish nationalist movement at the time. But devolution specifically is about British state power exercised by subsidiary bodies. What are effectively arms of the British state? We often think of Holyrood in purely Scottish terms, but Holyrood is a British institution that was created by the British Parliament, and it exercises the amount of British state power that Parliament allows it to exercise. The relationship is vertical. You have the British Parliament and you have Holyrood. It's in a vertical, not horizontal relationship. It's in a hierarchical, not level or equal relationship with the central British Parliament. And that's never been properly articulated by our politicians. But when you understand that, then you can see where devolution is going wrong. It's going wrong because it's not properly understood in that hierarchical, vertical manner. So that's essentially what devolution is. British state power exercised by subsidiary arms of the British state, which Holyrood is, which Stormont is, which the Cardiff Assembly is. Now sometimes you'll hear things about, you'll hear the phrase devolution settlement. We hear that a lot up here. Something's not in accord with the devolutionary settlement. Well, what does that even mean? What this means is there are two models of devolution. There is a conferred powers model and there is a reserved powers model. Now, the proper model to do devolution, if you wish to maintain the power, authority and integrity of the central state, the proper model for devolution is called a conferred powers model. Now, what that means is that everything is considered reserved to the central state, except that which is specifically written down as devolved. And that means the central state can keep its authority, and if it decides to devolve something, it writes it down and it gives it to its devolved subsidiary arm. It's called the conferred powers model. That's the correct way to do it. The presumption is that all powers are retained. But of course, the Labour Party in 1997 didn't think about that, and they chose the very worst kind of devolved model, which is called the reserved powers model, which means that everything is considered to be devolved. Everything is considered to be given away, except that which is written down, except that which is remembered to be written down as reserved to the Central British Parliament. In other words, the overriding presumption is that everything is given away, everything is devolved, except that which you've remembered to write down. And that's dangerous to the stability of a unitary state, because that model includes the devolution of things which you've forgotten to write down as reserved. Things which you don't even know about yet, powers which haven't yet even been invented yet, over things which we don't know about yet. To strengthen the Union, that so-called devolutionary settlement should be changed so that we have a conferred powers model where everything is considered to be reserved except that which you decide to write down as devolved. Now, the chances of that actually happening at the moment, of course, are pretty slim, but at least we can point that out. At least we can talk about that. And that led on to a second point, which has definitely caused problems for unionists up here as we try to maintain some kind of semblance of a unitary state. And that's, we should, as unionists, which I'm speaking for, we should stop referring to Holyrood as the Scottish Government. It used to be called the Scottish Executive, which was the correct term for it because it's not a government. It doesn't have the powers of an independent government. It has the powers which have been given to it by the British state. So it was always called the Scottish Executive, but when the SNP took power in 2007, Alex Salmond had a look at the law and he realised that he could simply change what he wanted because nothing had been written down otherwise. So he changed it to Scottish Government. He changed the logo. The logo was a nice Scottish royal coat of arms, which had a nice British relevance historically. And he changed the name to Scottish Government. And he did this because he could. He knew that nobody had remembered to write down that he couldn't do that. And the Labour government at the time certainly did not have the imagination or the nerve to stop him doing that. However, as James VI himself said, you cannot have two heads on one body. And when we hear MPs talking about Scotland's two governments, you know that is just confusing the reality, the constitutional reality, because you can't have two heads on one body and you're suggesting that these two governments are somehow equal in power when they're not. Holyrood is very much a subsidiary arm of the more powerful British Parliament. So we would argue as unionists that we shouldn't get into this federalist fantasy about having a separate government in Scotland, which is to misrepresent the actual constitutional relationship as it exists. So what should we call it instead? Well, there's nothing wrong with calling it the Holyrood administration, or the SNP administration, or the Scottish administration, or even calling it the Holyrood executive again, but it's not constitutionally or technically a government, because it does not have the independent powers of a government. So that's just a couple of points there that I would talk about regarding the actual constitutional settlement, such as it is. Another point we should ensure, if we want to keep the Union together, is to stop the civil service being used to break up Britain. You may not know, but if you're a taxpayer in England, or if you're a taxpayer even in Scotland, you pay for the civil service here in Edinburgh, who work hand in glove with the SNP to produce reports about how best to break up the United Kingdom. So we as British taxpayers are actually paying the civil service to write big long reports. The entire white paper that was released in 2013 rather, was written by the British Civil Service. It's an entire manual how to break up Britain. So it seems wrong that the civil service should be used to do that. So that's one thing that we can point out. We have nothing against the civil service being used to help promote SNP policies. That's what it's meant to do. But when it comes to actually breaking up the constitution of the United Kingdom, that should certainly be a no-go for the civil service of all things. And I have to tell you that if there were to be a second referendum on independence, we as Unionists could not compete with the power of the British state itself working to break up the United Kingdom. So that's something that has to stop. And again, it's a consequence of this devolutionary settlement, because it can be argued that these actions of the civil service were not specifically written down as reserved powers, and so they can therefore be considered to be devolved powers. Therefore, they can follow whatever Holyrood requires them to do. So that has to stop. Another thing that we can do if we're intent on strengthening the Union is to build up the Scottish civil service again. The Scottish Office again. We should build up the Scottish Office. Now, the Scottish Office is now called the UK Government in Scotland. Prior to devolution, it was based at St Andrew's House, which is a massively imposing building in Edinburgh. The Scottish Office today is simply just a small building in the corner of Melville Crescent in Edinburgh with only a handful of employees. But the Scottish Office is essentially the British Parliament in Scotland. And if we want to build up that connection, that idea of Scotland having a British polity, then the Scottish Office has to take a central role again in running the country. And we've long advocated that one way of doing that is to make the Scottish Office in charge of all the local councils. Devolve power to the local councils, but make sure that the people from whom the power is being devolved is not Holyrood, but is in fact the Scottish Office. And that's a way of putting the British Parliament once again at the centre of local life in Scotland, giving a better balance of powers as well. Moving on from these constitutional issues to the practical policies of a second referendum, which could easily be lost, by the way, by us, because the Scottish nationalists, or the separatists perhaps is a better term, only need 5% of the vote up here. 5% plus 1, and they'll pass the 50% plus 1, which is all that they need to win. So the first thing that should happen there, if we wish to strengthen the Union, is simply to rule out a second referendum. And the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has the absolute mandate to say that it should be ruled out. You'll hear a lot about the SNP saying that they have a mandate to hold one, but they forget that Westminster has a mandate to forbid one. The mandate of Westminster stems from the 2014 vote, where a majority of us said we want Westminster to be in charge of these issues. Furthermore, at the 2017 election, almost 600 of the 650 members of Parliament stood on a manifesto of opposing another Scottish referendum, and they were elected to do so. So the majority of Westminster MPs have a mandate to oppose a second referendum. And furthermore, the SNP accepts that, because if the SNP did not accept that, then they would not send their MPs to Westminster. So Westminster has a clear political right, and has a moral right, and has a democratic right and mandate to forbid a second referendum, which it needs to do. But if for some reason there were to be a second referendum, there's plenty that can be done differently from last time to ensure that we can get 1 or 2 percentage points out of it, just as a consequence of the franchise and the ballot paper and various thresholds around that. You know, let's presume that there is going to be a Brexit. Let's presume, therefore, that European Union citizens will no longer be allowed to vote at elections throughout Britain. Now, I don't know if you all are aware of this, but European Union citizens can vote at every election in Britain except the British general election. They can vote in English local councils, Scottish local council elections, Scottish referendums. They weren't allowed to vote at the Brexit referendum because that was held under the British Parliament franchise. But let's presume we get a Brexit. EU citizens will not be allowed to therefore vote again. Here in Scotland, the SNP believe that the European Union citizens are a big demographic who are going to vote to break up Britain. Whether that's right or not, I don't know, but certainly some of their their work tends to suggest that European Union citizens would vote to break up the UK if it meant Scotland was going to rejoin the EU. So the SNP are looking at this and they're thinking, how can we keep the EU citizens on the electoral roll? And they've come up with this idea of changing the franchise from a citizen-based franchise to a residency-based franchise. At the moment, you have to be a citizen either of Britain, Ireland, the Commonwealth, or the EU. What they're going to do is they're going to try to change that, where you just simply need to show a Scottish address. And if they can do that, then they can keep everybody on the franchise, and they can bring a whole lot more people onto the franchise as well, including people who have lived here but are not citizens, people who just got off the boat yesterday, people in prison, everybody, so long as you can show a residence. So that has to be addressed, and we have to ensure that if there were to be a second referendum, the franchise has to be sorted out, and it should be the same franchise as was produced at the Brexit referendum, which is to say British citizens only, 18 years and over, plus some Irish and Commonwealth citizens who are given the vote for historical reasons. Another thing, get the ballot paper and the question and answer correct. Many of you may not have realised that on the 18th of September 2014, when we went to vote on the question of whether the United Kingdom should be destroyed, essentially, should Scotland be an independent country? So you were going in, you were looking at it, and the concept of the actual country that was at heart of it, that was going to be rent apart, the United Kingdom, wasn't even mentioned on the ballot paper. Compare that with the EU referendum ballot paper, where the European Union was mentioned 5 times. So, just little things like that can be worth hundreds, if not thousands, of votes. We also, myself and a colleague who were permitted participants, we were at the count. And here's something as well. The question was, should Scotland be an independent country? Yes or no? If you actually wrote the word yes in the yes box, it was considered a yes vote. If you wrote the word no in the no box, it was considered a double negative, and it was scrapped. And there was scores of people were doing that in Glasgow. And so throughout Britain, throughout Scotland, it would go into the hundreds, and all of these votes were discounted. But if you put yes in the yes box, you got your vote counted. Well, that's absurd. That should never happen again. Another thing which was ridiculous about the ballot paper was should Scotland be independent? Yes. No. The no box was below the yes box. And, that's not how the alphabet works. So as a permitted participant, I spoke to the Electoral Commission about that, and they said, they wrote to me and they said, this issue was assessed, and there was a view that in plain English, yes would naturally come before no. To do it the other way would risk confusing the voter. Hope this answers your question. Well, it doesn't really answer our question at all. It made us wonder what on earth was going on. But certainly if that format was to be used again, and I hope that it's not, then no should come before yes, because that's how the alphabet works. And at the very least, I'd probably be against having a yes-no answer. Ideally, we want the positive answer on our side. We didn't have the positive answer on our side last time, but we still won. If we had had the positive answer on our side, we would have won even more. But I think that we don't really want the yes answer on our side again, because the word's been so confused and corrupted that it wouldn't help us to now have the yes. Far better perhaps that we just have a neutral question posed, such as was the case at the European Union election. So those are just some matters there related to the referendum. Other things perhaps policy-wise, things that we should do to help strengthen the Union. Number 9, raise the profile of Britishness in Scotland. This is something that my organisation, A Force for Good, does at all the SNP rallies that they hold. We'll line up our thin red line, we'll fly the red, white and blue, we'll fly posters, and we'll generally make a sort of pro-British scene, raising the profile, the fact that there are British people in Scotland, a majority in fact, who will stand up for it, raising the profile of Britishness, because if you're not doing it, then it doesn't actually exist. And I don't want to get too sort of mystical about that, but if you believe to have the substance of things, you need to have the spirit of things. To have the spirit of things without substance, to have the substance without spirit is going nowhere. So if you believe in Britishness, you have to do Britishness. You have to give it substance, you have to give it existence, and that's what we do when we fly the flag. Such a simple act, but flying the flag is so important, and that's why the SNP are taking it down from all of their government buildings which they control. They passed an edict last year that the Union Jack was not to be flown on any of the designated days that it was normally flown on, and these tend to be historical or monarchy-related days. They passed an edict. It was to be taken down and was to only be flown on the 11th of November, which is Remembrance Day. And so they understand the importance of the British colours, and they have a plan to essentially eradicate it from Scotland. So when they take down the flag, we have to keep putting it up, just like in the old days when you dropped the flag in battle. You had to lift it back up again to show that you were still there. And there's various ways, cultural ways, that we can do that, which I won't get into at the moment. Another thing that we need to do, if the Union is to be maintained, is to make Brexit, and let's presume it's going to happen, and make Brexit a great success, make it a prosperous success, use it as a project for national renewal. Now, it was hinted at earlier that we certainly don't have the politicians in Parliament who will do that, and I am very sympathetic with that particular point of view indeed, because Brexit was essentially a people's revolution against the elites, a peaceful revolution, a bloodless revolution, and the elites still don't want to do Brexit, and that's why it's chaotic at the moment, because it's not being led by men and women of vision. What can we do about that? We can hope. Those of us who are religious can pray for leaders who will come up and who will take the reins of this massive opportunity, because there's huge opportunities out there when we engage with a world of 194 countries instead of just 27 remaining in the European Union. And there's huge potential, again, to build up the British family, as we were talking about earlier, to build links in whatever ways are now suitable in the modern world with the former, with the Commonwealth, and the many people with whom Britain still enjoys goodwill worldwide. So our vision, A Force for Good's vision, is that the four corners of the UK will come together to make Brexit work, that will be free in new ways to reinvest, to reindustrialise, to create jobs, that will remain committed to the peace and prosperity of Europe through serving in various alliances and continuing to trade, but especially re-establishing strong relationships with the Commonwealth. Vast potential for that, and that prosperity can help bind the Union, and that's why the nationalists are so afraid of it, because they know that it has a potential to strengthen the United Kingdom. That's why they want to do it down. That's why they want to pretend that we're all animated and motivated by some sort of strange desires or jingoistic desires, whatever they like to throw at us, because they know the danger of Brexit and the power it has under inspired leadership to renew the United Kingdom. Number 11, before I get to my final point, is that as Unionists who believe in the unitary state, we want to be opposing what's called federalism. Now, federalism is this idea that we can have 4 different parliaments in the United Kingdom and somehow that they'll all be equal. And it's the Labour Party mainly that are promoting that here in Scotland. And they're promoting it because they think that it's an alternative to unionism. But federalism is not unionism, very much nothing to do with unionism, in fact. It's a stepping stone to separation. And it wouldn't work any better. In fact, it would make it worse for Scotland, because England would have 2 big, huge... the English Parliament would come to dominate the British Isles, is essentially what would happen. The English Parliament would become more powerful than even the British Parliament. That's just the way that the powers are going to lie in time. And so rather than the Scottish nationalists having a gripe about Britain and the British Parliament, there'd be a whole new conflict would break out between Scotland and England, led by the Scottish nationalists. Because we shouldn't mistake some of the people in the Scottish Nationalist Party. They don't believe in a Scottish Parliament. Many of them don't believe in a Scottish Parliament because it's some kind of democratic thing. They believe in it because they do believe themselves to be intrinsically different from the English. Their position is based upon difference. It's not really based upon some kind of democratic longing. And the final point is the personal. It's like we as individuals, what can we do in life to promote what we believe in, and that's coming back to things that were mentioned earlier today. Well, speaking as a unionist to people who want to get involved in helping to save the union, I understand that many of us are not necessarily in a position, and this to do much, because we're at college or we've got jobs where we can't do much. But those who can do things, I always encourage them to find people who are doing something that you support, and try to join with them. If you can't join with them, is there other ways that you can help? Do you have a garden where you can have a summer barbecue? Do you have a house that you can allow people to meet in? There's always things that people can do. And at the end of the day, if you can't do anything, can you help fund them, for example? Or can you just at least stay in touch with them? Find out what they're doing. Give them moral support. There's always things that we can do. Staying in touch, helping with social media, sharing, retweeting, joining people physically on the street, providing financial backbone to people, purchasing merchandise even. When I walk about Glasgow, I have a hoodie. I'm not normally so well dressed. I have a hoodie which got a Union Jack hood. And that's just flying the flag. I'm not walking down the street carrying a flag. That would be silly. But I'm walking down wearing the flag, And that's something that you can do if you want. Everybody can do these things. I know ladies who have Union Jack handbags, for example. Union Jack t-shirts, Union Jack cap. Where I live in Govan, I see quite a lot of people with Union Jack hats. I even know people that fly Union Jacks in their back garden here in Scotland. And that's about raising the profile of Britishness in Scotland. Another thing is just in conversation, saying, well, if somebody's having a go at the UK, saying, well, I believe in the United Kingdom, Why? I'm British. I want us to stay together. You don't have to go into any more depth than that. You don't have to go into the price of oil or the Barnett formula or anything like that. You just have to know that I'm British, I like the United Kingdom, and I want us to stay together. And sometimes if you're talking to nationalists, they're like, what? I've never heard anybody say that before. Because nationalists do live in a bubble, there's no question about it. Scottish nationalists I'm talking about, Scottish nationalists do live in a bubble. They only talk to people and they only befriend people who think like them. And when they suddenly get out or they watch the television and they see somebody that doesn't agree with me, what's happened here? What's gone wrong? One of the funniest things in the last 24 hours was William Mitchell, who appeared on Question Time the other night, the guy with the red top on. He's a well-known unionist, and he totally eviscerated the SNP lady on the panel. And that was all over social media. And the interest and response from the Scottish nationalists, and including the former MPs and MSPs, is like, who does this guy think he is? What's he doing? How could he hold that opinion? How did he get allowed to say that? He's been on Question Time before. He shouldn't have been able to get on again. It's like they just don't know that, goodness me, there's people that actually disagree with the Scottish Nationalist Party orthodoxy. So, yeah, these are things that we can all do. Speak up and fly the flag, and also vote at the end of the day. A lot of our people don't bother to vote, which is a complete disaster, of course, because you have to vote, in my opinion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.